Okay, so as we get to the 1950s, we'll have a few video lectures. The first we're going to have is anti-communism and Cold War culture. Then we will get to acts during the Cold War, and then we'll get to what was known as the Proud Decade, the economic and political positives of the 1950s. So, of course, we're all familiar with HUAC, the House of Un-American Activities Committee. This was originally established in 1938. This would certainly be abetted by the Cold War later. And as we discussed a little bit last week, there's actually McCarthyism before McCarthy. You think back to the Red Scare of 1919, 1920, and some of the anti-communism at that time. Of course, early on in World War II, part of appeasement is about using Hitler and Germany to protect the West against Soviet communism. So he was a kind of a buffer zone, which kind of helps to explain some of the quote-unquote rationalization for that. I would also bring up the Hollywood 10. HUAC went after Hollywood. They got studio heads to name names of communists, even without evidence. 19 were named and interrogated by HUAC. This is where we get the infamous question, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? 10 would cite the First Amendment as prohibition on HUAC's right to even ask the question. And they would be held in contempt and jailed for over a year. They were soon blacklisted. There was protest. 500 of the creative community signed on to, well, quote, the Committee for the First Amendment because they deemed these trials as disloyal to the spirit and the letter of our Constitution. They also formed a radio campaign called Hollywood Fights Back. Didn't necessarily defend the 10, but it stood on the principle of free speech. Who was involved in this? Folks like Humphrey Bogart, Lauren Bacall, Ira Gershwin, John Huston, Jane Wyatt, Danny Kaye, Gregory Peck, James Stewart, Rita Hayworth, Frank Sinatra, Spencer Tracy, Katharine Hepburn, and many others. But these were kings and queens of the entertainment industry, so when they spoke, people listened. Of course, the country didn't have the obsession with celebrity that we do now, but thanks social media. Still, though, hundreds of artists would be blacklisted for years. Some spent time in jail for contempt, and Hollywood would, in many ways, only get behind the anti-communist sentiment. We'll touch upon that a little bit later when we get to Cold War culture. We also have spies. Now, Alger Hiss is one, and then the infamous couple, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were part of a Soviet conspiracy to steal American atomic secrets. Now, when we get to McCarthy, of course, a lot is made of McCarthy. He lied, he exaggerated, et cetera, but it does not change the fact that there were Soviet spies in the administration, in government, etc. The Verona cables, Verona, were made public in July of 1995. They offered proof that Julius photographed documents and diagrams that were brought to him by a small ring, mostly young fellow communists he met at City College in New York. And the espionage effort was vast. It involved leaders of the United States Communist Party and as many as 220 spies. Ethel's brother worked at a machine shop in Los Alamos, New Mexico, where he picked up information on the design of the plutonium device, which would later be dropped on Nagasaki. He provided crude sketches to Julius and others that were then shared. They would be easily convicted. Roy Cohn, C-O-H-N, was the key prosecutor. We'll get more on him later. He is a giant in legal realities in the United States, particularly after 1945. So again, they're easily convicted, but the big issue was that they were given the death sentence in the electric chair specifically. This was a seemingly normal young Jewish American couple. Their friends had no idea they were spies, and this only ramped up paranoia of the time, because if average people like the Rosenbergs and American heroes like Alger Hiss were spies, who else could be a spy? Now, a little bit on Cold War culture, and then we'll get to McCarthy. Stephen Whitfield has a work called The Culture of the Cold War, and this is still the standard. I first read this at KU in '92, and it is still assigned by graduate schools. According to Whitfield, there was an overreaction in American politics to communism. This filtered down to popular culture as well. There was little to fear internally, as the Communist Party was somewhat weak and the number of actual communists was relatively low. But the anti-communist movement exploded because of the Soviet possession of the bomb, their use of terror to promote values antithetical to those of the United States. For example, they emphasized a powerful state, a lack of individualism in the Soviet Union, and of course the espionage trials of seemingly normal folks like Hiss and the Rosenbergs. Whitfield concludes that the very totalitarianism those in the United States were trying to defeat was used to quell dissent, limit personal freedoms, and scare folks into subservience. How did they do this? Loyalty tests, show trials, informers, blacklists. Even in popular culture, films like On the Waterfront glorified those who would, quote, name names. Authors like Mickey Spillane portrayed communists as unintelligent and crazy. They used anti-communist themes to promote characters and stressed vigilantism at the local level. Toys like Barbie were seen as representative of the American way of life. She and Ken were blonde with blue eyes. Her many accoutrements reflected the abundance of American life in the 1950s. She had so many clothes at her disposal. She had a swimming pool, a dream house, vehicles, etc. It was not enough to buy the Barbie. One had to purchase all these other items to make her complete. She represented what Marx would call the fetishism of commodities. Now, of course, he wasn't speaking about Barbie. Marx wrote in the 19th century. Barbie is a product of the 20th century, but again, you can kind of connect these dots. Signs of subversion were associated with perversion. For example, homosexuals were portrayed as too weak to fend off the advances of communist aggressors. Thus, they were more vulnerable than heterosexual people. History textbooks were purged of objective discussion of socialism or communism. They focused on patriotism. Social reform was deemed suspicious. For example, the civil rights movement was often equated with communism. And of course, King would later gravitate towards socialism. And he focused on economic disparities. So this is, it's obviously a severe exaggeration. Increasingly religious nature of the country in the face of godless communism. Now, of course, this is when one nation under God is added to the this Pledge of Allegiance. Some people consider this, somewhat lame, but Marxism claimed that religion was an opiate for the masses. It was an atheistic political reality. So this really was part of the ramp up toward more Christianity. We see the rise of Billy Graham in this context, who declared that communism was a satanic evil, and that capitalism and Christianity were intricately connected, offering spiritual conversion and worldly success. Now, a little bit on this. The first chapter of my thesis focuses on this in Puritan New England in the 17th century, but if you're familiar with Max Weber, his work, The Spirit of Capitalism, Weber talks about how many of the key tenets of Christianity, and specifically Calvinism, do very much promote capitalism and worldly success. And this was something that ministers in the 1700s had difficulty with. But again, it's something that we see many of these, many of the values, thrift, for example, hard work. These are all things that you can associate with Calvinism and, of course, success in capitalism. So I want to go back, though, to Whitfield, again, his main thesis that the very totalitarianism those in the United States were trying to defeat was actually used to quell dissent, to limit personal freedoms, and to scare people into subservience. This goes back, of course, to the long telegram, one of the things Kennan warned us about, and that is, becoming that which we are trying to defeat. So, again, something to consider. This is kind of something that you'll see really throughout the next few decades as the Cold War is fought. So let's get to McCarthyism, of course. This is always the excitement when you get to the 50s. The kickoff of McCarthyism, February 9th, 1950. Joseph McCarthy goes to give a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia. He has two speeches that he could read. He must choose one or the other. One focuses on housing issues in the area, which is why he came there. The other focused on communists and the government. He decided to allow a local Republican who had picked him up at the airport to decide which speech he should give. Of course, we know which one he chose. A few quotes. Quote, "I cannot take the time to name all the men in the State Department who have been named as active members of the Communist Party and members of a spy ring. I have here in my hand a list of 205, a list of names that were made known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party and who nevertheless are still working and shaping policy in the State Department. Now, he didn't have any names. He didn't have any proof of communism. What he had was a 4-year-old letter that's from 1946, which was written by Secretary of State James Burns to say that of 3,000 people screened at state, 285 had not been recommended for permanent employment, and 79 had been separated from the service. So, again, this is not a list of 205. It is a list of people who were denied permanent employment, and there are a variety of reasons for that. One could be that they were shown to be communist, but obviously a large amount of those 285 that's not going to relate to. Now, later, McCarthy was asked for the letter. He claimed he left it. He left the list in a suit that was on the plane. Classic. Later, he claimed that he had the names of 57, quote, card-carrying members of the Communist Party. From a report by ex-FBI agent Robert Lee, who examined state loyalty files and put question marks against the names of 57 men. More than half of those 57 had already been cleared. 22 were still under review. Again, lies and exaggeration. Now, McCarthy had a few nicknames. He was Smilin' Joe. He was the 10-cent Robespierre. He was Tail Gunner Joe because of some of the lies that he had put on his resume. Now, McCarthy and his personality. He was cantankerous. He was fake, and people knew this when they met him. And there are many stories of people talking about him well before the McCarthyism debacle had begun, to talk about how duplicitous and how two-faced he was. He was a self-made man. He became a judge by the age of 31. He would be the youngest senator in the United States Senate by the time he was 38. Those are impressive. But he was also censured for destroying evidence when an attorney forged a document declaring he had been wounded as a tail gunner in the Pacific. Again, he lied about this. He was called Tail Gunner Joe, ironically, because of this. And again, he was censured for destroying evidence that was presented to show it wasn't true. He cozied up with special interests while a senator and was not that popular even in Wisconsin. One of the reasons he's going to give this speech, one of the reasons really we see for McCarthyism, even though he gives the speech in West Virginia, is he wants attention. He wants to make sure that he can earn that the second term as a United States senator. And he knows that communism is on the nation's radar. He would instill fear in Truman and Eisenhower, in academics all over the country. He turned friend against friend, ruined careers of many, and led millions to suspicion of others, from family members to neighbors. He was against communism, so anyone who criticized him must be in favor of communism. Yeah, I love that kind of reasoning. Why McCarthyism? Again, this was a key issue among Americans, the atomic bomb, and of course the Soviet possession of such a bomb. We had lost China to the communists. This is one of the major criticisms of Truman. So we have communist China. We have Korea, of course, which we will get to in a coming segment. Soviet expansionist imperialism. There is great national anxiety about this. We have the McCarran Internal Security Act, an immigration act which opened up quotas for those from Asia, but also more strenuously screened potential immigrants. Anyone declared as a subversive by the Attorney General who was denied entry would be denied entry, and members of communist and communist front organizations were subject to deportation. Senator McCarran, quote, if this oasis of the world should be overrun, perverted, contaminated, or destroyed, then the last flickering light of humanity will be extinguished. Truman would veto the act. Congress overrode his veto, which again tells you the type of paranoia that was so dominant at this time. Now, again, McCarthy is politically motivated. He's up for re-election. He needed something to differentiate himself from other potential candidates for his Senate seat. With friend Edmund Walsh, Joseph McCarthy decided to play on the nation's anti-communist hysteria. Again, we go back to February 5th, 1950 speech in which he supposedly publicizes or names, or doesn't name, but claims that there are 250 or 205 people who are communists. What would he do? Of course, we're aware he held hearings to embarrass and humiliate witnesses. He doctored pictures and released them to make it look like his personal and political enemies were in cahoots with known communists. This, of course, was a popular method of Joseph Stalin, eliminating Leon Trotsky from pictures during Bolshevik era. era. There's one example that we see. Millard Tydings was a senator who had led an investigation debunking McCarthy. He would be included in a composite picture with communist leader Earl Browder. The caption, "Oh, thank you, sir." This was published in the media by newspapers as a real picture, even though it was not a real picture. Again, McCarthy put the two together. I mean, this is pre-Photoshop, but he was a talented guy, right? So the media publishes this, and this would help to defeat Tydings in his 1952 election. Again, it just goes to show the lies and the duplicity. Now, what deems someone a danger? What deems someone a communist, potential communist? It turns out the FBI maintained files on anyone who they believed could be a danger, which was essentially anyone who showed public support or criticism of social concern. Authors such as Sinclair Lewis, William Faulkner for his stand on civil rights, Ernest Hemingway for his support of the Spanish Republicans during their Civil War. John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath was declared, quote, un-American. Theodore Dreiser, poets Robert Frost, E.B. White, Carl Sandburg. These are the type of people who were considered a danger. One person was accused of close association with communism. Why? Because he had attended a rally at Yankee Stadium at which Paul Robeson spoke. And it was actually not even the person was accused of close association with a prospective communist because that person, his brother, had attended the rally. Economist and liberal John Kenneth Galbraith was watched. One informant called him doctrinaire in a communication to describe his political views, but those who were listening to Galbraith's discussions misheard this as a doctor Ware. Instead of doctrinaire, a doctor named Ware. So Galbraith was deemed a follower of a sinister subversive named Dr. Ware, even though there was no such person. Again, the absurdity of this is just, it's kind of funny at this point. I mentioned the Hollywood 10. There's a great movie that really, I think, encapsulates this era, and that's The Way We Were. Robert Redford, Barbara Streisand. It's an amazing movie, but it really kind of takes a look at what people were feeling. Redford is a conservative in the movie, if I remember right. Streisand is somebody who is quite liberal, and she is really concerned about how all this is going down, naturally. So basically anyone with an activist background was deemed a danger. Now, where's Eisenhower when he becomes president? Even before he's president, he refused to repudiate McCarthy because that would only give him the publicity he wanted. Quote, "I refuse to get down in the gutter with that guy," he said, but he had also approved civil appointments later of folks who would turn out to be communists. Now, how did all this end? I get back to Roy Cohn, who we will get back to again when we get to the 60s. Cohn is a major figure, again, in American law, and he had some skeletons in his closet that he could not share at the time. Now, Cohn was McCarthy's assistant. He had tried to prevent a friend from being drafted, but the Army refused. They turned on the Army, McCarthy and his associates, accusing it of coddling communists. Think about this. You've got McCarthy accusing the American military of coddling communists. He claimed that there was a spy ring at Army Signal Corps at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. He went so far as to go after a frail, middle-aged cafeteria worker, claiming that she was in cahoots and was promoting communism. The Army released a report on Cohn's efforts to protect his friend, David Schein, and a Republican senator from Vermont, Ralph Flanders, denounced him on the floor of the Senate. Edward R. Murrow attacked him on the evening news as well, using McCarthy's own words against him. Now, the Army-McCarthy hearings held for 36 days. McCarthy refused to budge, even though Cohn had come to an understanding with Army Counsel Joseph Welch and tried instead to smear one of Welch's young assistants. McCarthy did. Welch's famous rebuke, quote, "Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You have done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you no sense of decency?" Now, again, this would kind of begin to turn the tide. People began to recognize he's going after the military. He has a weak argument. Welch even would later say to McCarthy, quote, "I like to think that I am a gentle man, but your forgiveness will have to come from someone other than me." The Senate would vote 67 to 22 to condemn McCarthy for, quote, "conduct contrary to the senatorial traditions," and that was it. Within a few years, he would die of acute alcoholism. Now, what's sad about this is it's the corruption of McCarthy and his cohorts that brought him down. It wasn't about his tactics. It wasn't about his lying. It wasn't about his lack of proof, his false assertions. It was a personal issue, one that focused on an assistant of his to boot. Now, one interesting note here, McCarthy, Cohen again was McCarthy's chief counsel. Notably, Robert Kennedy wanted that job, and he was denied it. And many believe that Kennedy was the one behind disgracing Cohen, the latter arguing that this was out of spite because he got the job instead of Kennedy under McCarthy. One other important piece of note is that Schein was Cohen's boyfriend. I don't know, partner at the time, but they were a couple, and that was why he was trying to prevent him from getting drafted. Of course, this had to be kept quiet at the time. And again, Cohen's career is quite interesting, and we'll get more to him. But again, kind of the interesting final point of this is that McCarthy is finally brought down. But again, it is not his tactics, his lies, his lack of proof, his false assertions, etc. It is corruption, and it is within his own group. And if Cohen had not made that remark and McCarthy did not go after the army, what could have happened? All right, next we will get to actions during the Cold War.